We're going to have lunch at 1, so we have 20 minutes now for the panel discussion. I'm not going to round up the morning session. So if I could ask the panel to come up. I think the panel going to be chaired by Giles Maskell, who's president of the Royal College of Radiologists, along with Rajesh Banerjee, Sheila McGuinness from the EGC, Jonathan Sellers, and Kathy Sudlow from UK Biobank. I think they're going to focus mainly on some of the image analysis and also issues around incidental findings. But if you do have questions either to the panel or to the previous speakers on imaging that you'd like asked, then there are roving mics, people with numbers, or you can just hand them a slip or hand me a slip, and we'll try to get as many questions answered. Giles, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rory, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Giles Maskell. As Rory said, I'm a clinical radiologist and I'm the president of the Royal College of Radiologists. And what I thought we'd do is just briefly ask each member of the panel to introduce ourselves so that you know who we are. And then I'm going to take a question from the audience, which I've got here right away, and then we'll get into the discussion about feedback and so on. So start at the far end. I think it's on.
Hello?
Yes.
Yep. I'm Kathy Sudlow. I'm a neurologist and clinical epidemiologist from the University of Edinburgh, and I'm the chief scientist for UK Biobank.
I'm Jonathan Sellers. I'm a private practice lawyer, and I'm also the legal counsel for Biobank.
My name is Sheila McGuinness. Is this on? I'm an academic lawyer based at the University of Bristol. I'm a member of the Ethics and Governance Council and was part of the small working group on feedback in the Ethics and Governance Council.
I'm Rajesh Banerjee. I'm a general physician in Oxford. I'm also CEO of Perspectum Diagnostics, one of the industry partners in the abdominal imaging group.
Okay, thanks very much. So, Rajesh, if you want to hang on to the microphone there, because the first question I've got here, I think is right up your street. And the question is BMI measurement now outdated, and should we be looking instead at distribution of fat?
BMI measurement is still useful, as is waist circumference. If you're measuring BMI, I would encourage you to measure waist circumference. But I think you've seen from all the presentations that we're now at a point where we can do more sophisticated measurements of body fat distribution and composition. And I think Jimmy's slides about how you can have someone or 4 people with the same BMI but completely different metabolic health profiles and visceral fat distributions shows that BMI alone probably isn't as strong as some people hoped it would be maybe 20 years ago.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. That's very helpful. So we're going to move the question on to the question of feedback. And Kathy, I think you've got a couple of slides you wanted to show to sort of introduce the topic.
Yeah, so hopefully this will work out okay.
If we can see.
Yeah, here we go. So one of the issues that we've grappled with and which has come up earlier is what to do when someone comes for an imaging visit and something's spotted on one of their scans, and what we should do about the feedback of those findings. And this is quite a complex area, much debated, a lot of heat, some light. But prior to the biobank study with the generation of very large numbers, there had been very little information on the impact of feeding back this kind of information to people, on the false positives and the false negatives generated, and on what that would mean if one actually systematically followed up participants. So we decided that together with our funders and the Ethics and Governance Council, who've worked very closely with us on this, that this was an opportunity to study this. And the first 1,000 participants who came through the imaging assessment at Biobank contributed to this information. So to define what was an incidental finding that would warrant feedback, we came up with this definition of a potentially serious incidental finding. That's one that would, if it was confirmed to be an actual serious finding, be in some way threatening to someone's lifespan or to their quality of life, or have a major impact on their body function. So for the first 1,000 participants who came through, we actually compared 2 different mechanisms for evaluating incidental findings and for determining their feedback. So we had a panel of radiologists reporting all of the sets of scans. Those are specialist doctors who in day-to-day work within the health service report scan findings. So that was done subsequent to the imaging visit over the next week or so. And then we also had what we initially laid out as UK Biobank's protocol for handling incidental findings, which was to make them truly incidental, if you like, in that if the radiographers who are present at the time of the imaging and are the technical people who help us to acquire the scans spotted something that they thought was serious and worrying during the course of scanning, that would be forwarded to a radiologist, reported on, and if a potentially serious finding was confirmed, that would be fed back. So running these two mechanisms in parallel, we were able to actually explicitly compare those and see what would happen. So we were able to compare for those two mechanisms the number of people who were identified as having a potentially serious finding and the proportion of participants from each of those two different mechanisms. And then systematically to follow up individuals who receive feedback about a potentially serious finding to find out what actually happened to them, what was the actual clinical diagnosis, and we did that by way of questionnaires to the participants and to their GPs and a series of chasing telephone calls to find out about people who hadn't responded to those questionnaires to really get to grips with this. So here was the process. The first 1,000 image participants, all of their scans were assessed using those two different mechanisms. So on the one hand, radiologists reporting all of the scans, and then on the other hand, radiographers flagging the suspicious scans and forwarding those for reporting. And just showing you the results of those processes, so radiologists are trained to find problems. That's what they do. And they found problems in 179 of the 1,000 participants. That's sticking to that rigorous UK Biobank definition with some guidance across modalities about the types of findings that would and would not be regarded as potentially serious. From a radiographer perspective, they're not looking for diagnoses, and these are not indeed scans, as you've heard earlier, that are designed for the diagnosis of disease, but nonetheless, from time to time, they would pick up something that they thought was worrying using the same set of guidance, and they did that in about 66 people, and of those, 18 were confirmed by the radiologist to be potentially serious findings. So about a 10-fold ratio there in the findings that would be picked up by a radiologist versus a radiographer with radiologist confirmation. About 2%, just under 2% in the hands of radiographer flagging, and just under 18% with radiologists systematically reporting all the scans. So following those individuals up for 6 months to establish the final clinical diagnosis and with a clinical adjudication process done by 2 people to check for reliability, to see what finally turned out to be serious and what turned out not after all to be serious according to that definition. Of the 179 in the radiologist reporting group who received feedback, 21 of those turned out finally to be clinically serious, and the vast majority, 158, or about 8 out of 9, were not in the end serious. They were a combination of benign findings, imaging artifacts, or things that were already known to the participants. And there were 21 of those findings that were clinically serious, some of them tumours that would not otherwise have been picked up so early, some of them heart problems, and various others. So amongst the radiographer group, there were about 5 of those who turned out to be clinically serious and the rest non-serious. So in both groups, the majority of these findings are false positives in that they turn out not to be serious in the end. There are less, quantitatively significantly less, false positives with radiographer flagging, but on the other hand, there are less of the truly serious findings that are picked up through that route. I'll stop there and leave those data up so that we can have a further discussion if that's desired.
Thank you very much, Cathy. That's an extremely helpful summary. I think what it illustrates very nicely is something that clinical radiologists recognise very well, is that our ability to find things wrong is almost limitless. You know, we can find something wrong in anybody, but what it turns out to mean is another matter altogether. So these findings went to the Ethics and Governance Council, I think, and would have been considered there.
So what I'm going to do is just give some background to the discussions that the EGC had with UK Biobank about this whole process. And it really is a nice example of the sort of integrated engagement that Rory mentioned earlier. So when I joined the Ethics and Governance Council in 2011, there was already a small section of the committee thinking about feedback in a general sense. So this is that kind of blue sky activity that Elaine mentioned before. So looking into the future about how things come up, which meant that when Biobank approached the Ethics and Governance Council in our kind of role as a sounding board about the imaging study, we were quite well placed to sit down and have those discussions about how the study would be developed, and it was really very integrated. So the Ethics and Governance Council were consulted on the development of the application to the funders. We had involvement as part of the review process. The funders spoke to the Ethics and Governance Council, and indeed afterwards for the sociological research that has just been mentioned, a member of the Ethics and Governance Council was worked a little bit, I think, with Kathy on some details of how the study might go forward. So that's the kind of overview of the kind of integrated approach to trying to work as an advisory group for Biobank, or as a sounding board for them on these issues, that I thought might be useful context to this.
Thank you very much. And the approach, obviously, one of the things you'll have considered is what other studies, we've heard reference to other studies before. So, Jonathan, you're the lawyer here.
Sure.
How is this different from what other studies have done, and why?
Thank you very much, Charles. I mean, we talked to all the major studies, the Recontact study and MESA and similar, and what we discovered is they'd all done different things, and most of which protocols that they'd used, they'd changed. And so we thought from that probably the best thing to do was work it out ourselves, really from first principles. We've read the literature and looked at the studies and devised really our protocol pretty much from the first principles. I think that the most important thing to say, particularly to the participants, is that what we were guided by more than anything else is that we wanted to do something which had the most net benefit and had the least net harm. And that was our underlying sort of mantra throughout the process. And what this study of the first 1,000 participants has done is it's enabled us to test it both quantitatively, to look at actually what the figures say, and also qualitatively in terms of what the participants actually think. And it's actually, we're in the process of actually publishing the results of this, which we're, I think, about 2 or 3 months away, probably. And so I think it's been an extremely interesting exercise, which has, I think in our view, it's confirmed that the protocol that we thought was the best protocol is in fact the best protocol for us. This is not to say it's the best protocol for every single study, because every single study has to consider this issue, but really on its own merits. But for the sort of thing that we as Biobank were doing, this we believe validates the protocol that we've chosen.
I think one of the factors that was touched on in the earlier panel discussion was the interface with the NHS, because of course what you've seen, I think, from here is that if all these patients with potentially serious abnormalities were referred into the NHS, that would be quite a big load, wouldn't it, Kathy?
Yeah, so during the course of follow-up through questionnaires to the participants and GPs, we were able to find out what the impact of these raw numbers was on people and on their interactions with the health service. So to give you a few examples, about a third of the 179 individuals who received feedback had some sort of blood test. About 80% of them had some sort of further imaging, either a further clinical rather than research scan of the type they'd already had with Biobank, or another sort of scan to investigate the potentially serious finding further. We found out about the emotional impact on them. Many of them, unsurprisingly, were anxious. For many of those people, that was not a long-term problem because it was resolved, but it took some weeks or even months or longer, in some cases, for that anxiety to be resolved, so that's not trivial. And for a proportion, around about 10% or so, there was some impact on their overall health, or on their finances or insurance and so on. So both for individuals and for the health service, opening this Pandora's box, if you like, is not a trivial issue at all.
Did you get anybody coming back saying, I wish I'd never done this, or I wish I'd never agreed to it?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So despite all of this activity, for individual participants, in excess of 98% were still glad to have taken part. And we're still glad to have been told. Their GPs, those who responded, felt somewhat differently. And primary care practitioners, about half felt this had been a good or net beneficial experience for participants, and about half felt contrary. But we didn't hear from some GPs, so we have to regard those data with some caution.
Okay, thanks very much. Rory, I don't know if you've got any questions there that came from the room.
Yeah, I think there's one question really to the panel and one to some of the imaging experts. So one question that was, how is recruitment of a subset for further studies, e.g. cognition, handled if people at greater risk will be invited specifically in terms of, say, their personal risk score? How do you avoid disclosure of risk for Recontact? I guess the question is around how do you avoid it being effectively feedback of information that an individual didn't have, whether it be about genetics or dementia score or a measure on imaging? I don't know whether Kathy or Jonathan want to comment on that.
I think as is evident, our feedback policy is that we can't reveal to participants things of which they're actually unaware. So, for example, we couldn't have a Recontact study which says we're recontacting you on the basis that you test positive for the ApoE4 gene. On the other hand, if they're actually already aware of it themselves, or indeed it's in their clinical records and it's apparent that they've actually been made aware of it by their practitioners, that is something that we can actually contact them about. I mean, I don't think there's any particularly easy answer to this, but there are means by which we can actually I think we can use information which is in the resource to actually effectively recontact them.
So I guess the question is, to what extent should a participant who's recontacted worry that that's because there's some problem with them or something which is going to show up in a further
I think they shouldn't worry. I think they shouldn't worry anymore because it's something they'd be already aware of. I think the main thing that we absolutely can't do is actually sort of say we're contacting you because brackets you're not actually already aware of this, because I think that's not sensible. That's not in accordance with our consent, and nor do I think it's a particularly practical thing to do.
And I think one of the things that we can do is if, for example, there's a study that is relevant to individuals with particular characteristics, say ApoE genotype, is not contact specifically those individuals, but contact participants and say, would you be interested in such a study? If you are, then there is this other research team. So I think the UK Biobank can, in principle, be with very careful control and very careful information, can be a way in which to increase recruitment into particular kinds of study. Okay. But this is something that we're having discussions with the Ethics and Governance Council about how to manage it, and we're doing some very careful initial studies. I don't know whether Sheila wants to comment on.
Yes, so this is, as Rory says, it's something that we're beginning to have discussions with. A couple of members of the EGC are going to be speaking with Biobank about how to develop protocols for recontact and linkage that meet the expectations and needs of the participants and Biobank. So yes.
And then a second question, which is more, I think, to the imaging experts, but it may be that Rajashi can comment on this. But the question is, do you believe Biobank has a shelf life, given the rapid changes in technology, screening, number of smaller specialized cohort studies? Again, you might want to comment, but I don't know whether some of the other imaging experts would like to comment on, okay, you've used the best imaging now, but in 10 years' time, that equipment would be considered defunct.
I think organizationally, Biobank is very well future-proofed. In terms of choice of technology, I'm a generalist, so when I look at the specialist imaging used, it's actually ahead of its time. So the Biobank liver imaging is not available on the NHS. The Biobank cardiovascular imaging can only be done by about 40 cardiovascular professors globally. So I think technically it's I'm not going to say future-proof because that implies that there's no progress in the future. But I think we're looking very much at the kind of techniques that are going to be scaled up over the next 15 or 20 years, which will effectively, without sounding too grim, cover most of the lifespan of most of the Biobank participants. So I think we're looking at a study from an imaging perspective that's technically going to define how we build the diagnostic pathways, not just for this generation, but for the next generation as well.
And do you think it would be right to say that the next advances are more likely to be in the analysis of the images that we've got rather than new and better images?
Absolutely, and I think the key to imaging in medicine is that imaging is part of a diagnostic pathway. So some of the problems we've talked about here, where you take a scan out of context and then you have to decide how to interpret it, and you end up with 179 findings that could be abnormal or could be normal or someone might know about. That's not how we really practice medicine. We practice medicine because someone comes with a symptom, whether it's a headache or tummy pain or something like that, and then they go through a diagnostic pathway. The brilliance of Biobank is it has all the resources to create new diagnostic pathways, whether it starts with a socioeconomic demographic, or whether it starts with a symptom or an existing disease or a genotype or a phenotype. And then you can build in all the rest to create those pathways. So it's not just the processing of the images that will sort of define a lot of the research in the next 10 to 20 years, but it'll be the combination of the imaging with the other data sets, which everyone's referred to as probably the world's richest medical data set, that will allow that to happen.
Thank you very much. Anything else you wanted to raise, Rory, before we...
No, I haven't had any more written questions. I mean, I would say that with respect to the kind of future-proofing point, the way in which the samples were collected as well was done not with a view to measuring particular things, but with a view to being able to measure a wide range of different kinds of things in the sample. So analogous to the imaging, the idea with the imaging is that one could do more and more analysis and pull more and more, if you like, assays out of the imaging, so too with the way the samples were collected and stored.
Thank you. We have a question. Do we have a question here? No, sorry. I just saw somebody standing up and I thought, no. Okay. I think we're pretty much out of time, aren't we, Rory? It's,
yeah, I think we're at the lunchtime.
Okay, it's lunchtime. Good news.
So, lunch is where the coffee was. Anybody who advised us of dietary requirements, if they see the catering team, then they should also be looked after by them. Thank you.